Welcome back to our study on the book of Genesis for the spring semester of 2026. Last time we left off mentioning the patriarchal stage of the book of Genesis. Up to now we've looked at Adam and Eve, and we looked at Noah. Then after the flood, Genesis chapter 9, God starts setting up human government. Last week we looked at the Tower of Babel, the dispersion of the nations, of the people with different languages. And as I mentioned last time, we know for sure when the languages began in Genesis, but we never know when the races began. I speculated as to what possibly could happen. Could have been instantaneous at the Tower of Babel, so that each one could recognize those of like language, or it could have been because of the ones who started speaking different languages. God gave certain DNA so that their offspring would become whatever race that God intended for them to be. We just don't know, and nobody can be dogmatic about it. We know that they began, but and it wasn't through evolution. Evolution makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. In fact, it's just utterly ridiculous to speculate about that. But however, we know the races began. Now in Genesis chapter 12, we see the beginning of the patriarchal stage with the calling of Abraham, and of course his progenitors, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, who became the founders of the nation of Israel. Jacob, with the nation being named after him. But eventually, through Moses, the children of Israel would come out of Egypt and they would go into the promised land and begin what is today the nation of Israel. Abraham, we call him Abraham from the very beginning. Of course, originally, remember, his name was not Abraham, it was Abram. But God would call him to be the father of many nations. And that's what the word Abba means. In the Hebrew, A-B-B-A means father. And so we see here the prefix Abraham, the father of many nations, many people, father of a multitude. He will become father of many nations, but father of multitude, really what it means. But through the different children that he would have, with not only Isaac, but Ishmael as well. And then later on, he would have children through Keturah, where the Midianites would come from, as well as other people. So he was the father of many nations, but father of a multitude of people. And of course, that's where the Hebrew children would come from, through Abraham. By habit, I often talk about Abraham as being a Jew, and technically he wasn't a Jew, he was a Hebrew. Hebrew, the word Hebrew means across the water, across the river. And so when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees and he crossed over, that's where the name began. Who are these people? They're the ones from across the river. And so the children of Israel at this time were known as the Hebrew children. Abraham was born around 2166 BC. We can close in on that date pretty close. And I'll give you a chart here in a second, but we can close in on that date because of the ages of his descendants, going forward to the building of the temple, and then the second temple, and then the destruction of the temple. The dates are pretty much given in the Bible, not explicit. I mean, there's no verse that says he's born in 2166. But if you do the math, and it's not hard to do that, and several years ago I was going to write a little booklet, a little chart on the dates, and I still have it somewhere, and it grew into, I don't know how many pages, 30-some pages maybe, or more, of dates in the Bible, or ages of people in the Bible. And this, of course, Abraham, like I said, he was born around 2166 BC, which would put him at the same time, and we don't tend to think of this sometimes, we forget, but it would put him at the same time as men like Job, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, so, and then Melchizedek. It's speculated that maybe one of these men actually led Abraham to the Lord. We don't know that, I'm saying I'm speculating here. But nevertheless, we do know that the time period was the same. And sometimes when we read the Bible, we forget that. We forget that these men lived long enough to where their lives overlapped one another. In fact, here on the chart, of course, all these dates here are BC, before Christ. And so by doing the math of the different descendants of Noah and of Abraham and of other characters throughout the Bible, and through Joseph's brothers, Joseph himself, we can actually come up with a pretty good date. We know, according to the scriptures, that Noah was at his son's birth here of Shem. He was 500 years old, and he died in 2106 BC, making him live to be 950. Shem, therefore, was born, if he was 500, he was born in 2556 BC, and at his son's birth, we know that he was 100, and he died somewhere in the year 1956 BC. He was around 600 years old when he died. The flood, as I mentioned last time, the flood came around 2458 BC. So after the flood, then others started being born. Arphaxad was born in 2456, so 2 years after the flood. He was 35 at his son's birth, which is Selah. So he died in 2018, making him 438 years old. Selah, 2421, not going to read through all these, but nevertheless, we know the ages where they were born. The father was born, and we know when he died. Therefore, just doing the math, you can track it down to Eber. Eber, remember, or not Eber, but rather Peleg. Peleg, remember, that was 101 years after the flood. 2458 minus 2357 is 101. 101 years, that's when the continents were divided. It talked about that, how that I believe that what very likely was the scenario of the earth at that time is that there was much more ground upon the earth than there is today. And then at the time of this great quaking and flooding, as Peleg's name actually means, it means to quake and to flood, that the land masses above, and what I tend to describe them as, is like a land bridge. And that land bridge, people can walk across, and they scattered throughout the world. And then when that water shook, that land fell down into underneath, which would be the oceans. And of course, then the water from the oceans would come above that and formed what we have today as the world that we live in. So I think that makes a whole lot of sense, because the Bible does say at his time the continents were divided, and that would cause a division of the continents at his time. And so Peleg here, and then Reu, a brother of his, 2327, Serug, Nahor, Terah, the father of Abraham. We know he was 70 and he died in 2031. He lived to be 205. And we know then that Abraham was born in 2166. And so 16 years after Abraham was born, remember this is backwards here because we're BC, 2150, which is 16 years after Abraham, we believe that's approximately when the book of Job was written. So Abraham would have been around 16 years old when the book of Job was written, and therefore he would have known Job at the time. But you also notice here that Shem died in year 1956 BC, and Abraham died in the year 1991 BC. So Shem actually outlived Abraham. Am I doing that right? I think so. Yeah, so 56, 60, 31, 36 years. Shem lived 36 years longer or after the death of Abraham. So therefore, very likely, they could have known each other. Maybe not, I mean, because it depends on where Shem lived at the time. We know where Abraham lived at the time. We don't know where Shem lived at the time. But nevertheless, it's interesting if you look at these dates here and ages of the fact that during the patriarchal stage, the first patriarchal stage with Abraham, a lot of these biblical characters did live at the same time. So, in fact, 2106, Noah lived up until 2106, so he lived up until the continents were divided. After the continents were divided, so he witnessed not only the flood, he witnessed the division of the continents. And I don't know about you, I find that very interesting, that a lot of these characters did live at the exact same time. And we tend to lose that because we think of, you know, your great-great-great-great-grandfather, which, what would that be? Father, grandfather, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, or well, at least eighth, when Abraham was alive, his eighth great-grandfather was still alive at the same time. And of course, that's not the way we perceive life. Some people see their great-grandparents. I don't think many people would see their great-great-grandparents. I guess that's possible. But after that, you know, nobody would think about seeing their eighth great-grandfather alive and walking around on the earth like we think of. Abraham, of course, very main character in the Bible. Mentioned 237 times in the Old Testament as Abraham, 74 times in the New Testament, quoted in 27 books of the Bible, 16 times in the Old Testament, 11 times is he quoted in the New Testament. So you can see a very influential man that was used by God, because Abraham believed God and it was counted him for righteousness, and God used him in many mighty ways. Abraham was the reason, in fact, that the southern kingdom was spared as long as it was. If you remember, the northern kingdom went into captivity in 721 BC. The southern kingdom did not go into captivity beginning until 606 BC, and finally completely taken in 586. But the scriptures tell us in 2 Kings 13:23, and the Lord was gracious unto them and had compassion on them and had respect unto them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them, neither cast he them from his presence as yet. So the influence here of Abraham, of course, Isaac, and Jacob as well, but the Abrahamic covenant, as we'll look at in Genesis 12, began that promise, that covenant with Israel, that an unconditional covenant that we'll look at in 12, and we'll also see in eventually when we get to chapter 15, and the importance of that covenant that God made with Abraham, and then it was passed from Abraham to Isaac, from Isaac to Jacob, and Jacob to the children of Israel as a nation. And so we know that covenant will be performed. Abraham was born and raised in Ur of the Chaldees. Now, on the map here, you can see over here is Israel, and then over here, of course, today is modern-day Iraq, in Iran. Baghdad be up here along the Tigris and Euphrates River. Was right here, not too far from the Persian Gulf, a very important place in the world today. Of course, oil and all the fighting going on in the Middle East today surrounds that area. But Abraham, if he were born today in he would be living in Iraq at this time. Of course, Persia was Persia until beginning of the 20th century, early 1900s, and I don't remember the exact date, but Persia became Iraq and Iran. And so when we talk about Persia today, typically when people refer to things that are Persian, it refers to Iran, but technically both of those were part of that dynasty at one time. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran, and Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. So the names in the Bible, while oftentimes we just skip over them quickly, they do matter because it shows, again, the authenticity of the Scriptures. God does not have to prove himself to us in any way whatsoever, but he does so sometimes by these names that seem to be obscure and insignificant to us, but when we trace the lives and the history of them, we find that the Word of God is accurate up to the most minute point that oftentimes we skip over without realizing it. You know, I just think of Jeremiah 22 with Jehoiakim, later known as Jeconiah, the 18-year-old king who went on the throne, spent 3 months on the throne, and then God cursed him because of his wickedness. And God said, "Cursed be Coniah," and while that name Jeconiah means God established, Coniah means self-established. So instead of calling him that I established you, you're self-established, and I'll curse your descendants, and none of them will ever be prosperous sitting upon the throne of David. And then Joseph, as in Joseph and Mary, came through that line, and his line was cursed as far as being a king. Now, doesn't mean he was cursed, and none of the descendants were cursed in that they went to hell or anything like that because of it, or that God was even harsh on them. It just meant that they were not qualified to be king after that. And so Joseph, if he were the father of Jesus, Jesus would not qualify to be king. And so it was one of the reasons for the virgin birth. Well, oftentimes we read Jeremiah 22, and a lot of people do, and never think about who Jeconiah's descendants were and how important it is, and how that minute detail that is totally lost on some people. When we see that, I love to see things like that because it just, again, not that God has to prove anything to me or anybody else, but the evidence of God's hand in the Word of God is so amazing that every detail matters. Every detail of these names matter. Whether it's Sarah or Nahor's wife Milcah, or the daughter Haran, the father Milcah, the father Iscah, all these things matter. While they may not matter to us as an individual person in our relationship with Jesus Christ, overall they do matter because, again, it just proves the Scriptures. Well, is located in Mesopotamia, which is Persia, Babylon. Later became the Grecian Empire, later the Roman Empire, and then Persia lasted through all those, just like Israel lasted through the Babylonian captivity as Israel. There was a seaport on the Persian Gulf. I actually had the privilege of, I was teaching a Bible conference in the country of Jordan, and one of my students was born in of the Chaldees there. So, and here I put a possible This may have been where the Garden of Eden was at. And I just say that as possible, and that's based upon the Euphrates. Genesis 2:14 talks about the Euphrates River, and we know Euphrates River was there. However, the only problem with that is we don't know if God's telling us where the Euphrates River was in Genesis 2, and then later on where it was in Genesis 12. Because remember, from Genesis 2 to Genesis 12, a couple of great cataclysmic events took place. One was the flood, and the other was the division of the continents. And so the place where the Euphrates River was may have changed somewhat. We don't know. Now, I tend to think that it was in the same place, is my guess, because it would make sense that God would just refer in Genesis 2 to Euphrates where it was at the time the people lived. In Genesis 12, days of Moses, they understood where the Euphrates was and all. So, that being said, it's possible that's where Eden was. Now, obviously it's not there anymore. We don't know when God removed it. We know it was after Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, sometime after that. We don't have any clue as to when, but we know that it was after them. It wasn't at the same time, because remember, God put the cherubim up with the flaming swords to keep Adam and Eve from going back into the garden. Has nothing to do with the hanging gardens of Babylon, even though, because in fact, you look it up, hanging gardens of Babylon probably weren't really hanging gardens of Babylon. They were the hanging gardens of Assyria, because Assyria controlled the land at that time. But nevertheless, the name of the third river is Hiddekel, which that is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria, and the fourth river is Euphrates. So the Tigris, Euphrates River, very well-known rivers there in the Middle East. Abram came from a family that worshiped idols. In Joshua 24:2, it tells us about it. It says, "And Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood." Okay? Other side of the flood, other side of the river. This is where the word Hebrew would come from. So you came across, you were Hebrews in old time. Even Terah, the father of Abram, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. So Abraham came from a idolatrous family, which most people really do in some way or the other, even today. Even if you come from a Christian family, sometimes people get off the mark and find other things more important than God, unfortunately. In Genesis 12, we have the calling of Abram. I put Abraham up here because tend we use them synonymously, Abram or Abraham. There is technically a difference in them when God would change the name of Abram to Abraham. But the call comes in Genesis 12, verse 1, and he's commanded to leave Ur. Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. So Abraham initially, on a certain level, obeys the Lord. He does get out of the country. However, he doesn't get away from his kindred and from his father's house initially. It takes him a little while to do that. The covenant, Genesis 12, 2 and 3, most significant covenant, one of the most significant covenants in the Bible as far as the history of Israel. Abram would have been about 75 years old at the time. Remember, he lived to be 175, so after giving the covenant, he lived 100 years. Sarah, around 10 years younger, so 65 years old time. And Abraham received the sevenfold Abrahamic covenant. And these are the parts of the covenant. First of all, I will make of thee a great nation. Of course, Abraham didn't live to witness all of that, but God told him that's what would happen, and it did happen. I will bless thee, and obviously God definitely blessed Abraham. I will make thy name great, and as I mentioned a while ago, the number of times here, 237 times in the New Testament, 74 times in the Old Testament, quoted 27 times, 16 in the Old, 11 in the New. So most people, in fact, I think anybody in the world just about, if you mention the name Abraham, they'll know where it comes from, and they'll know of that name. Thou shalt be a blessing. Of course, he was upon other nations. I will bless them that bless thee. Here's where the covenant goes into the covenant that was given to Abraham, and therefore through his, as it was passed down to Isaac, Jacob, and then to the nation of Israel. That covenant is still definitely in effect today, and therefore we have a great responsibility as believers to make sure that we pray for Israel, we support them. We don't have to agree with them, and I've been asked this question many times, because everything that Israel does today doesn't mean that it's right. They're a nation that, as a nation, they've rejected their Messiah, and therefore they're going to be wrong in many things that they do. However, God doesn't look on that as far as the Abrahamic covenant is concerned. His promise is that one day God's going to gather together again the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah and bring them back together. They'll become one nation. That's all going to happen. None of that's based upon the works of Israel, but it's based upon God's promise. And that promise is still in effect today. So when we bless Israel, when we support Israel, God will bless us. When we turn away from Israel, curse them, God will curse us. And historically, you can look throughout history and see the nations that have opposed Israel, how they suffered, and nations that have supported Israel, how they have prospered. And so God keeps His word. And then, of course, in these shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And we see that through one of Abraham's descendants, the greatest of all descendants, of course, being Jesus Christ. And so God has blessed the whole world through the coming of the Messiah, through the descendants of Abraham. Now, as I mentioned a while ago, and I'm going to back up here and read that verse again just to remind you of it. Now the Lord said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house into the land that I will show thee. Well, Abram did get up and leave Ur. Unfortunately, he did allow Terah and his father Terah and his nephew Lot to join him. And of course Terah ends up not going any further, but we know Lot did. Now, we don't know exactly, of course, God blesses us in spite of ourselves very often. And none of us are perfect in the way that we serve God, the way we live our lives. It would be great if we would do that. We should strive to do that. However, when we don't do that, I'm glad God just doesn't wipe us out and say, because you failed in this one little area, then I've had it with you. Abram wasn't a perfect man in all his ways, but he did overall have a heart to serve the Lord. They temporarily settled in Haran. Haran would come later on when we get to talking about Jacob. When Jacob flees Esau, he goes up to Haran, also known as Padan Aram, same place, Haran, where some of his ancestors' people were, and that's of course who he joins up with Laban and Rachel and Leah, as well as others up there. But they temporarily settled there. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son, Abram's wife. And they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came into Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So now Abram has left his father behind, but he does take Lot with him. I don't know if that's what went against God's initial command or not. It might have been that it wasn't against it. I really believe that Lot, well, the reason I believe is because the Bible tells us that Lot was a saved man. And so therefore, I don't think there would have been a problem with him going with Abraham at this point. Now, when you look at Lot in the Old Testament, and all you do is read the Old Testament, it'd be hard to consider Lot as being a saved man. But when you get to the New Testament, we find that he definitely was a saved man, but he was a carnal believer at the time. 700 miles northwest of Ur and 60 miles from the Euphrates. This is where Haran was at, and this is what that area is known as the Fertile Crescent. And so a very important place at that time. But you see the distance that they traveled, 700 miles northwest of Ur. It's quite a distance in those days. It's quite a distance in our day, but definitely quite a distance in Abraham's day for them to have traveled as they did. And of course, they were Bedouins, nomads. Abraham lived in tents his whole life, and therefore he traveled with quite a group of people with him. So this is quite a journey, leaving Ur and going up to Haran. But remember, all this land that Abraham covers, and we'll talk more about others areas later, but all that land that he covers, God has promised to the nation of Israel. And one day Israel will possess all of that land. All right, we will talk more about this next time.